Your sister's family comes first. You're always last, my father said, his voice calm, almost bored, as if he were commenting on the weather instead of placing me at the very bottom of my own family. I didn't argue. I didn't even look at him right away. I simply set my fork down beside my plate, the soft clink barely audible over the hum of the dining room, and in that moment something inside me shifted in a way I couldn't undo. Dinner had started like it always did on Sunday nights, with the smell of roasted chicken filling the house and the long oak table set with dishes I had brought myself, as I had done for years without being asked. My sister Laura sat across from me, her husband beside her, their 2 kids laughing over something on a tablet. My father, Richard Carter, sat at the head of the table, shoulders straight, eyes sharp, the same man who had once told me family was everything. I had believed him. For 68 years I had believed him. Dad, I was thinking maybe we could plan something next month, I had said earlier, keeping my tone light, careful, the way I always did around him. Just us. Like we used to. He didn't even hesitate. Laura's family needs me more, he replied, cutting into his chicken without looking up. You'll be fine. I should have stopped there. I should have nodded, smiled, swallowed the familiar disappointment and let it pass like I always had. But something in me, maybe the quiet accumulation of years, maybe the weight of being overlooked one too many times, pushed me to ask, so where do I stand? That was when he finally looked at me. And that was when he said it. Clear. Simple. Final. You're always last. No one at the table reacted. Not Laura. Not her husband. Not even the kids, though they must have heard. The room didn't erupt into conflict. There was no dramatic silence. Just the steady continuation of dinner, forks scraping plates, glasses clinking softly, as if nothing had happened at all. As if I hadn't just been quietly erased in front of everyone. I glanced at Laura then. She didn't meet my eyes. She adjusted her napkin, leaned toward her husband, whispered something that made him smile. I had seen that before too, the small way she avoided discomfort. The way she let things happen without ever taking responsibility for them. It was easier that way. It always had been for her. I took a slow breath and looked down at my plate. The food I had cooked. The meal I had helped create. It sat there untouched. I realized then that I wasn't hungry anymore. Not for the food. Not for the approval I had spent decades trying to earn. Not even for the version of family I had kept alive in my mind long after it had stopped existing in reality. I pushed my chair back slightly, the legs brushing against the hardwood floor with a soft, controlled sound. My father didn't look up. I see, I said, my voice steady, quieter than I expected. And I did see. Not just what he had said, but everything that had led up to it. The birthdays where Laura's plans always came first. The holidays rearranged around her schedule. The financial help that flowed in her direction without question, while I was told to figure things out because I was strong. I had worn that word like a badge for years. Strong. Independent. Capable. I hadn't realized it also meant disposable. I stood up, smoothing my hands over the front of my sweater, a simple gray one I had chosen that morning without thinking much about it. No one asked where I was going. No one told me to stay. That told me everything I needed to know. I picked up my purse from the chair beside me, the leather worn soft from years of use, and slung it over my shoulder. For a brief second I considered saying something more. Explaining how it felt. Asking why. But the words didn't come. And even if they had, I knew they wouldn't change anything. Instead, I looked at my father one last time. He was still eating, still focused on his plate, as if the conversation had already ended for him. Maybe it had. But for me it had just begun. Then tonight will be the last time you ever rank me, I said, my voice calm, almost gentle. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't anger. It was a decision. He paused for a fraction of a second, his fork hovering midair, but he didn't respond. He didn't need to. I turned and walked toward the front door, each step measured, steady, the sound of the dinner continuing behind me, fading with every inch of distance. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. And as I reached for the handle, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to admit before. I had spent my entire life trying not to be last in a place that had already decided I didn't belong at the top. And for the first time, that realization didn't hurt. Clarified everything. I did not go far that night. My car was parked exactly where I had left it, under the old maple tree at the edge of the driveway, its branches casting thin shadows across the windshield under the porch light. I sat behind the wheel for a long moment without starting the engine, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, my reflection staring back at me through the dark glass. I expected to feel something overwhelming. Anger, sadness, maybe even regret. But there was only a strange, quiet clarity, as if a fog I had lived inside for years had finally lifted. Inside the house, through the window, I could still see movement. Laura leaning forward, animated now, telling some story. My father nodding. The children laughing. Life continuing without interruption. I watched them for a few seconds longer than I should have. Not because I wanted to be part of it, but because I needed to understand something I had been avoiding for most of my life. They were not excluding me in that moment. They had simply never included me in the way I had imagined. There was a difference, and realizing it felt like stepping onto solid ground after years of trying to balance on something that was never steady. I started the engine, the soft hum filling the quiet space around me, and pulled away from the house without hesitation. The road ahead was empty, the streetlights stretching in a long line, one after another guiding me forward. I did not turn on the radio. I did not reach for my phone. I just drove, letting the silence settle around me like something familiar rather than something to escape. By the time I reached my apartment, the clock on the dashboard read a little past 9. Early by most standards, but the night already felt long. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, greeted by the stillness that had once felt lonely but now felt honest. No expectations. No roles to perform. Just space. I placed my purse on the small table by the door and slipped off my shoes, setting them neatly side by side, a habit I had kept for years. The kitchen light was still on from that morning, casting a soft glow across the countertops. Everything was exactly as I had left it. Untouched. Unchanged. For the first time, that did not bother me. I walked to the sink and turned on the faucet, filling a glass with water, watching the clear stream hit the surface and ripple outward. Small movements. Simple actions. Grounding. I took a sip and leaned against the counter, letting the quiet stretch out around me. My phone buzzed on the table behind me. Once. Then again. I did not rush to it. I already knew who it would be. Laura most likely. Or my father, realizing perhaps that I had left without finishing dinner, though I doubted the realization carried much weight. When I finally picked it up, the screen confirmed it. 3 missed calls. 2 from Laura. 1 from my father. A text followed shortly after. Laura's name lit up the screen. You did not have to make it awkward like that. I read the message once. Then again. The words were simple, but they carried the same pattern I had seen my entire life. Not concern. Not understanding. Just discomfort redirected. I typed a response, then erased it. Whatever I said would not change how she saw the situation. To her, the problem was not what had been said at the table. It was that I had reacted at all. I set the phone down without replying and walked into the living room, lowering myself onto the couch with a slow exhale. The cushions sank slightly under my weight, familiar and supportive in a way that felt almost symbolic. I let my head rest back and closed my eyes, replaying the evening in small fragments. The sound of silverware. The way my father had not looked at me when he spoke. The way no one had interrupted him. And then my own voice, steady and quiet, saying something I had never said before. I opened my eyes and stared at the ceiling, tracing the faint lines where the light fixture cast soft shadows. For years I had told myself that patience was strength, that understanding would eventually be returned, that if I gave enough, supported enough, stayed long enough, something would shift. But nothing had shifted. Not really. The only thing that had changed was how much I was willing to accept. And tonight, that had finally reached its limit. My phone buzzed again. This time I did not need to check. I knew it would be more of the same. Explanations. Justifications. Maybe even a casual apology wrapped in excuses. I left it where it was and stood up, walking to the small desk in the corner of the room where I kept a few neatly stacked folders. Papers I had not looked at in a while. Documents that once felt like backups just in case. I pulled open the top drawer and took out a thin file, setting it on the desk and opening it slowly. Inside were copies of records, names, signatures, Dates that told a story very different from the one my father believed he controlled. I ran my fingers lightly over the pages, not with anger, but with recognition. I had not been as unaware as they thought. I had simply chosen not to act. Until now. I closed the folder gently and sat down in the chair, the decision settling into place with a quiet certainty. They had drawn a line that night, clear and deliberate. They had decided where I stood. What they did not realize was that I no longer needed their place at the table to define my own. The next morning arrived quietly, without ceremony, the kind of ordinary beginning that would have once convinced me to pretend nothing had changed. Sunlight filtered through the thin curtains in my bedroom, casting soft lines across the floor, and for a moment I lay still, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Nothing in the world outside had shifted overnight, and yet everything inside me had settled into a different place. I sat up slowly, letting my feet rest on the cool hardwood floor, grounding myself in the present instead of reaching for the familiar urge to replay the past. There had been a time when I would have woken up already drafting an apology in my mind, searching for the exact words that would smooth things over, that would make everyone comfortable again. That instinct did not come this time. Instead, there was only a clear awareness of what had been said and what it meant. I walked into the kitchen and started the coffee maker, the simple routine unfolding without thought, the sound of the machine filling the quiet space. While I waited, I glanced at my phone where I had left it on the table the night before. More notifications now. Missed calls. Messages stacked one after another. I picked it up, not with urgency but with curiosity, as if I were observing something from a distance rather than stepping into it. The first message was from my father. "You left without saying goodbye." I read it carefully, noting what was not there. No mention of what he had said. No acknowledgement of the moment that had caused me to leave. Just a statement, simple and detached, as if the problem had been my departure rather than his words. The next message was from Laura. "Dad is upset. You should call him." Again the same pattern. Responsibility redirected. Discomfort managed. I scrolled further. Another message from Laura. "We were just trying to have a nice dinner." I let out a small breath, not quite a laugh but something close to it. A nice dinner. The phrase lingered in my mind, almost ironic in its simplicity. I set the phone back down and poured myself a cup of coffee, wrapping my hands around the mug as the warmth spread through my fingers. For years I had accepted this version of events, the idea that maintaining peace was more important than acknowledging truth. That silence was kindness. That endurance was love. I took a slow sip and looked out the window, watching a neighbor walk her dog along the sidewalk, the leash loose, the morning calm. Life moving forward, uncomplicated in ways that felt almost foreign. My gaze drifted back to the desk in the corner, where the folder still sat exactly where I had left it the night before. It had been years since I had opened it with any real intention. Back then, it had been a precaution, something I told myself I would never actually need. I had trusted that fairness would eventually emerge on its own, that family would correct itself without intervention. That belief had been comfortable. It had also been wrong. Carried my coffee over to the desk and sat down, opening the folder again, this time with purpose. The documents inside were clear. Dates. Signatures. Ownership records that traced back further than anyone seemed to remember, except me. I had been there when the decisions were made, when the house had nearly been lost, when the accounts had been at risk. I had stepped in quietly, using my savings, restructuring what needed to be fixed, ensuring that everything remained intact. Not for recognition, not for leverage, just because it was family. And now those same decisions, those same quiet contributions, were being rewritten as if they had never existed. I turned a page slowly, my eyes moving over the details, not with anger but with precision. This was not about proving anyone wrong. It was about understanding exactly where I stood and what was mine to protect. My phone buzzed again, the sound sharper in the stillness of the room. This time, I let it ring out completely before reaching for it. A voicemail notification appeared. I hesitated for a brief second before pressing play. My father's voice filled the room, steady, controlled, familiar in a way that once would have softened me immediately. "Evelyn, I do not know what you think happened last night, but you overreacted. Call me back." The message ended as abruptly as it had begun. No pause. No reflection. Just certainty. I stared at the phone for a moment, letting the words settle, not into my emotions, but into my understanding. He believed what he said. Not because it was accurate, but because it fit the version of the world he was comfortable with. And for the first time, I did not feel the need to step into that version with him. I set the phone down and closed the folder, placing my hand flat against the cover for a second, feeling the weight of it beneath my palm. This was no longer about being included. It was not even about being valued. It was about clarity. About choosing not to accept a place that had been assigned without my consent. I stood up, carrying the folder with me as I moved toward the bookshelf in the living room, sliding it carefully into a space where it would remain within reach. Not hidden. Not forgotten. Just ready. I picked up my coffee again and walked back. Toward the window, the morning light now brighter, sharper, revealing details that had been softened earlier. I watched the street for a few seconds, then turned away, my reflection briefly catching in the glass. I looked the same. Nothing about my appearance had changed. But the way I saw myself had shifted in a way that could not be undone. And somewhere between the quiet of the night before and the stillness of this morning, I realized something simple and undeniable. I was not the one who had been left behind. I had just been the only one paying attention. By late morning, the quiet in my apartment had settled into something steady, almost deliberate, as if the walls themselves understood that something had shifted and were choosing not to disturb it. I moved through my usual routine with a calm that felt unfamiliar but not unwelcome, rinsing my coffee cup, straightening the small stack of mail on the counter, opening the window just enough to let in a light breeze. Every action felt intentional, not automatic, and that alone told me how much had changed overnight. There was a time when mornings like this would have been filled with anticipation, waiting for a call, a message, some sign that things would return to what I used to call normal. But now, I understood that what I had accepted as normal had never really been balanced. It had simply been consistent. My phone remained on the table, silent for a while, and I noticed that I did not feel the urge to check it every few minutes. That habit, too, had belonged to a version of me that was always waiting for someone else to decide when I mattered. Around 11, it buzzed again, breaking the stillness just enough to remind me that the outside world was still trying to reach in. I glanced at the screen. Laura again. I let it ring twice before answering, not out of hesitation, but because I wanted to be certain that I was choosing to engage, not reacting out of reflex. Evelyn, finally, she said, her voice carrying that familiar mix of impatience and practiced concern. Dad has been trying to reach you all morning. I did not respond immediately. I leaned lightly against the counter, looking out the window at the quiet street below, giving her words space without rushing to fill. I saw the messages, I said calmly. There was a pause on the other end, brief but noticeable. Well, are you going to call him back? She asked, her tone tightening just slightly. Not angry. Not yet. Just pushing. I took a slow breath. What for? I asked. The question seemed to catch her off guard. I could almost hear her adjusting her posture, recalibrating. What do you mean what for? She replied. He is upset. You left in the middle of dinner. There it was again. The same framing. The same careful avoidance of the actual issue. I let the silence stretch for a second longer than usual before answering. I left because of what he said, I replied, my voice even, not raised, not defensive, just clear. Another pause, this one slightly longer. Evelyn, you are taking that the wrong way, Laura said finally, her tone softening as if she were explaining something obvious to a child. He did not mean it like that. I closed my eyes briefly, not out of frustration but recognition. I had heard this before. Different words. Same pattern. The meaning of what was said always adjusted after the fact, reshaped into something easier to accept. How did he mean it? I asked. The question hung between us, simple and direct. For a moment there was no answer. Then, he just meant that I have more responsibilities right now, she said, her voice picking up a slight edge. You know that. The kids, the house, everything we have going on. I nodded slightly, even though she could not see me. And that makes me last? I asked. This time the silence was heavier. I could almost feel her searching for a way to respond that would not require her to admit what was already clear. That is not what anyone said, she replied, her voice sharper now, the patience thinning. I opened my eyes and looked around the room, taking in the quiet order of it, the absence of tension. "That is exactly what he said," I answered, not with emphasis but with certainty. There was a shift on the other end of the line, something subtle but unmistakable. The conversation was no longer about smoothing things over. It was about control. "You are making this into something it does not have to be," Laura said, her tone firm now, the softness gone. "We were having a nice evening. You could have just let it go." I let out a small breath, not a sigh, not a sign of defeat, but a release of something I had been holding on to for years. "That is the difference," I said quietly. "I always let it go." The words landed between us, and for the first time there was no immediate response. No correction. No redirection. Just silence. I did not rush to fill it. I did not explain further. I did not justify what I felt. I had done that for most of my life and it had never changed anything. "So what are you saying?" Laura asked finally, her voice lower now, more cautious. I straightened slightly, my hand resting lightly on the edge of the counter. "I am saying I am not going to do that anymore," I replied. The sentence was simple, but it carried more weight than anything I had said the night before. There was a long pause on the other end, and when she spoke again, her voice was different. Not softer. Not warmer. Just uncertain. "Dad is not going to like that," she said. I almost smiled, not out of amusement but understanding. "That is okay," I said. "This is not about what he likes." I ended the call before she could respond, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with a quiet finality that felt more powerful than any argument could have been. I set the phone down on the table and stood there for a moment, listening to the silence return, noticing how it no longer felt empty. It felt earned. For years, I had adjusted myself to fit into a space that kept shifting around me, always trying to stay in place without asking why the ground was never stable. But now, standing in the stillness of my own home, I understood something I had missed before. I had not been losing my place. I had been standing in a position that was never meant for me to begin with. And for the first time, I was no longer trying to stay there. The afternoon stretched out in a quiet, deliberate way, the kind of slow passage of time that allowed thoughts to settle into place rather than rush past unnoticed. I did not turn on the television. I did not reach for distractions. Instead, I let the silence remain, letting it do what it had been quietly trying to do for years, show me what I had been avoiding. Around 2 o'clock, I found myself standing in front of the bookshelf again, my eyes drifting toward the folder I had placed there earlier. It had not moved. Nothing had changed about it. And yet, it felt different now, not like a backup plan, but like something that had been waiting patiently for me to finally pay attention. I reached for it without hesitation this time and carried it back to the desk, sitting down with a steadiness that came from knowing I was no longer reacting but choosing. I opened it slowly, flipping through the pages one by one, not skimming, not rushing, but reading every line with care. Names, dates, signatures. Each detail anchored in a reality that no one else at that dinner table had acknowledged. I paused on one document in particular, tracing the line where my own signature appeared, dated years earlier, back when the house had been on the edge of being lost due to a series of financial missteps my father had never fully explained. I remembered that time clearly. The late nights, the quiet calculations, the decision to step in without making it a point of pride or leverage. I had not done it to be recognized. I had done it because I believed that was what family meant. I leaned back slightly in the chair, the memory settling over me with a clarity that no longer felt painful, just factual. Back then my father had not argued. He had not dismissed me. He had accepted the help without hesitation, without question. And over time that moment had been absorbed into the background, rewritten as if it had never carried any weight at all. I turned another page, then another, each one reinforcing the same quiet truth. The structure of what they believed belonged to them had been built on something they had chosen not to remember. My phone buzzed again, interrupting the stillness just long enough to remind me that the outside narrative was still trying to pull me back in. I glanced at the screen. This time it was my father calling. I watched the name appear, steady and familiar, the same name that once would have made me answer immediately, no matter the circumstance. I let it ring, not out of defiance, not out of anger, but because I wanted to decide if the conversation was worth having, not simply respond out of habit. The call went to voicemail, and a few seconds later, the notification appeared. I did not play it right away. Instead, I closed the folder and rested my hands on top of it, feeling the weight of everything it contained. For years, I had approached every interaction with the intention of preserving something that only existed in fragments. A version of family that depended on my silence more than my presence. That version had required constant adjustment, constant understanding, constant restraint. And in return, it had offered very little. I picked up the phone and finally listened to the message. My father's voice came through, sharper this time, less controlled than earlier. "Evelyn, this has gone far enough. You do not walk out like that and then ignore calls. We need to talk. Call me back." The message ended, leaving behind a tone that was no longer neutral. It was not anger in the way most people would recognize it. It was expectation, the kind that assumes compliance without question. I stared at the screen for a moment, letting the words settle without reacting to them. Then I placed the phone back down on the desk, next to the closed folder, and sat there in the quiet, noticing something that felt almost unfamiliar. I did not feel compelled to respond. Not immediately. Not urgently. Not at all. That absence of urgency was new, and it told me more than anything else could have. I stood up slowly, carrying the folder with me once more, but this time I did not return it to the bookshelf. Instead, I walked into the bedroom and opened the top drawer of my dresser, placing it inside with care, not hiding it but securing it. Not as a secret, as something I was now responsible for. I closed the drawer and stood there for a moment, looking at my reflection in the mirror across the room. The same face, the same posture, but something behind my eyes had changed. It was not hardness. It was not bitterness. It was clarity. I had spent years believing that maintaining connection required me to accept whatever position I was given, to interpret silence as peace, to accept dismissal as misunderstanding. But now, standing in that quiet room, I understood that connection built on that foundation was not stable. It was conditional, and conditions can be changed. I walked back into the living room, picking up my phone one more time, not to return the call, but to turn it face down on the table, removing it from immediate view. Then I sat down, resting my hands loosely in my lap, letting the stillness return once more. The difference now was that the silence did not feel like something I was enduring. It felt like something I was choosing. And in that choice, something else became clear. They had expected me to remain in place, to absorb what was said, to adjust and continue as I always had. What they had not expected was that I would step out of that pattern entirely. Not with noise, not with conflict, but with a quiet decision that would change everything that came next. The day moved forward with a quiet precision that felt almost deliberate, as if time itself had slowed just enough to allow me to see everything more clearly. I did not reach for my phone. I did not check for new messages. Instead, I let the space remain uninterrupted, giving myself something I had not allowed in years, room to think without reacting. By late afternoon, the sunlight had shifted across the floor, stretching longer now, softer, and I found myself standing by the window again, watching the same street that had not changed even though I had. It was strange how everything outside could remain exactly the same while something inside you rearranged itself completely. Around 4 o'clock, there was a knock at the door. Not loud, not urgent, just firm enough to be intentional. I did not move right away. I stood still for a moment, listening, letting the sound settle before deciding whether to answer. The knock came again, slightly sharper this time. I walked toward the door slowly, my steps steady, not cautious, not hesitant, just deliberate. When I opened it, Laura stood there, her posture straight, her expression composed in a way that told me she had prepared for this. She was not surprised that I had not answered the phone. She had adjusted. "You are really not answering calls now?" she said, stepping inside before I responded, her eyes scanning the room briefly as if assessing something. I closed the door behind her without comment and moved back into the living room, giving her space but not yielding it. "I saw the calls," I said simply. She let out a short breath, crossing her arms loosely, not defensive but not relaxed either. "Dad is upset," she said again, as if repeating it would change its weight. I nodded once, not dismissing it but not absorbing it either. "I understand," I replied. She watched me for a second, her eyes narrowing slightly, searching for the reaction she was used to. It was not there. "Then why are you acting like this?" she asked, her tone tightening. "This is not like you." That statement lingered in the air, and I recognized the truth in it. It was not like me. Not the version of me she had always known. "That is exactly the point," I said quietly. She shifted her weight, uncrossing her arms, her posture changing just slightly. "You are making this bigger than it is," she continued. "He did not mean to hurt you. You know how he is." I looked at her then, really looked, noticing the familiar patterns in her expression, the way she positioned herself between explanation and dismissal, never quite acknowledging the full reality of what had happened. "Yes," I said. "I do know how he is." There was a pause, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The room felt still but not tense. Just clear. "Then why are you doing this?" she asked, softer now, less certain. I took a slow breath, choosing my words carefully, not because I needed to convince her, but because I wanted to be precise. "I am not doing anything," I said. "I am just not ignoring it anymore." She blinked, the response not landing the way she expected. "Ignoring what?" she asked. I held her gaze. "The pattern," I answered. The word seemed to settle between us, heavier than anything else I had said. She looked away briefly, then back at me, her expression shifting again, this time towards something closer to frustration. "There is no pattern," she said quickly. "You are reading too much into this." I did not respond immediately. I let the silence stretch, not to create discomfort, but to allow the truth of what I had said to exist without being rushed past. "There is," I said finally. "And it did not start last night." Her jaw tightened slightly, and I could see the resistance building, the familiar defense of rewriting events before they could fully take shape. "So what, you are just going to cut everyone off now?" she asked, her tone sharper again. "That is your solution?" I shook my head once, slow and calm. "No," I said. "I am just not going to accept being placed last anymore." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that shifted something in the room. She was quiet for a moment, longer than before, her expression no longer certain, no longer controlled. "Dad is not going to change," she said finally, her voice lower now. I nodded slightly. "I know," I replied. "This is not about changing him." She looked at me, really looked this time, as if trying to understand something she had never needed to consider before. "Then what is it about?" she asked. I let out a small breath, not tired, not frustrated, just steady. "It is about me changing what I accept," I said. The sentence settled between us, and for the first time since she had arrived, she did not immediately respond. There was no quick correction, no redirection. Just silence. She glanced around the room again, slower this time, as if seeing it differently, noticing the absence of tension, the absence of urgency. "You are serious," she said quietly. It was not a question. I nodded once. "Yes," I replied. She stood there for a moment longer, then shifted her weight back, her posture less rigid now, less certain. "I do not know what you expect to happen," she said. I met her gaze without hesitation. "Neither do I," answered. "But it will not be the same as before." She held my gaze for a second longer, then looked away, the conversation no longer something she could control or redirect. And in that moment I realized something else, something just as important as everything that had come before. This was the first time I had spoken without trying to manage her reaction. The first time I had allowed my words to stand on their own, without softening them, without adjusting them to make them easier to accept. And the effect was not explosive. It was not dramatic. It was quiet. But it was real. And that was something I was no longer willing to trade away. Laura did not leave immediately after that. She lingered near the edge of the living room, her presence no longer as firm as when she had walked in, as if something in the conversation had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit. I did not rush her. I did not try to fill the space with more words. For once, I allowed the silence to exist without trying to shape it into something easier. She glanced toward the door, then back at me, her expression shifting between frustration and something quieter, something closer to uncertainty. "He is going to come here, you know," she said after a moment, her voice measured as if testing how I would react. I nodded once. "He can," I replied. She studied my face, searching for hesitation, For the version of me that would have immediately started preparing for that moment, rehearsing explanations, softening edges before the conversation even began. That version was not there. "You are really going to stand your ground on this?" she said, not quite asking, more confirming. I met her gaze without tension. "I am just not stepping back into something that does not work," I said. She let out a slow breath, her shoulders lowering slightly, the resistance in her posture easing just enough to reveal something underneath it. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," she said, but the words did not carry the same certainty they had earlier. I tilted my head slightly, considering that. "It has always been hard," I replied. "I just stopped pretending it was not." That seemed to land differently. She did not respond right away. Instead, she looked down briefly, her hands adjusting the sleeve of her jacket in a small, habitual motion. I had seen that gesture before, usually when something had shifted in a way she did not fully control. "He is not going to apologize," she said quietly, almost as if she were offering a warning, or maybe a justification. I nodded again. "I am not waiting for that," I answered. The simplicity of that statement seemed to unsettle her more than anything else I had said. For years, every conversation had revolved around expectations, around what might happen, what could change, what needed to be managed. Removing that expectation changed the structure entirely. "Then what do you want?" she asked, her voice softer now, less defensive. I paused for a moment, not because I did not know the answer, but because I wanted to say it without the weight of everything that had come before. "I want to stop being the one who adjusts every time something is off balance," I said. She looked at me, really looked, and for a brief second I saw something in her expression that had not been there before. Not agreement. Not even understanding. Just recognition that the conversation was no longer following the pattern she knew how to navigate. "That is not how families work," she said, but the conviction behind it was weaker now. I shook my head slightly. "That is how this family has worked," I corrected gently. "It does not have to be the only way." The room fell quiet again, but this time the silence felt different. Not tense. Not unresolved. Just open. Laura shifted her weight once more, then finally turned toward the door. "I will tell him you are not calling," she said, her voice returning to something more controlled, but still carrying that undercurrent of uncertainty. I gave a small nod. "That is fine," I replied. She reached for the handle, then paused, her hand resting lightly on the door as if something was holding her there for just a second longer. "He is not used to being ignored," she added, glancing back at me. I considered that, not as a challenge, not as a warning, but as a simple statement of fact. "Neither am I," I said quietly. That seemed to stop her for a moment. She looked at me, her expression unreadable, then opened the door and stepped outside without another word. I closed it gently behind her, the soft click of the latch echoing briefly in the quiet space. I stood there for a moment, my hand still resting on the door, feeling the absence of her presence settle into the room. It did not feel like loss. It felt like clarity. I walked back into the living room slowly, taking in the same familiar space, noticing how different it felt without the tension that used to follow every conversation like a shadow. My phone remained on the table, face down, silent. I did not pick it up. I did not need to. Instead, I moved toward the window again, looking out at the street as the light began to fade, the day shifting toward evening. The world outside continued as it always did, steady, predictable, unaffected by the small but significant changes happening inside one quiet apartment. And as I stood there, watching the light soften and the shadows grow longer, I realized something that had not fully formed until now. This was not a moment, not a reaction, not even a turning point in the dramatic sense I used to imagine. It was a decision, a quiet, deliberate decision that did not need to be announced or defended to be real. And once made, it did not require constant reinforcement. It simply existed, shaping everything that came after without needing permission from anyone else. The evening settled in slowly, the light outside fading into a soft gray that blurred the edges of everything beyond the window, and I found myself moving through my apartment with a quiet awareness that had not been there before. I did not turn on many lights. Just one lamp in the corner of the living room, enough to keep the space warm without breaking the calm that had taken hold. The silence was no longer something I noticed in contrast to noise. It had become the baseline, steady and unintrusive, allowing my thoughts to move without interruption. Around 7, my phone lit up again on the table, the screen glowing softly in the dim room. I did not need to pick it up to know who it was. The pattern had already been established. Calls. Messages. A steady attempt to pull me back into a conversation I had already stepped out of. I walked over and turned the phone face up, not to answer but to observe. My father's name filled the screen, the call continuing long enough for me to see it through before it finally stopped. A voicemail followed almost immediately. Then another call, this time shorter, more abrupt. I watched it all without reacting, noticing how different that felt from before. There had been a time when I would have answered by the second ring, my voice already prepared to soften whatever tension might be waiting on the other end. Now I simply stood there, letting the moment pass without stepping into it. After the third call, the phone went still again and I picked it up not out of urgency, but intention. I pressed play on the latest message, holding it lightly in my hand as my father's voice filled the room. "Evelyn, this is unnecessary. We can settle this like adults. Call me back tonight." The tone was measured, controlled, but there was something beneath it now, something less certain than before. Not quite doubt, but not the same absolute expectation either. I listened to the message once, then set the phone down without replaying it. The words did not require analysis. They were familiar in structure, even if the tone had shifted slightly. A call to reason, framed in a way that implied the issue was mutual, shared, something that could be smoothed over if I simply participated. I walked back to the window, looking out at the darkened street, the occasional car passing by, headlights cutting briefly through the quiet before disappearing again. Life continuing unaffected, steady in its own rhythm. Behind me the phone buzzed again, this time with a text. I did not turn around immediately. I let a few seconds pass, allowing myself to remain where I was before choosing to engage. When I finally looked, the message was short. "We need to talk. Tonight." I read it once, then again, not searching for meaning but confirming what I already understood. This was not a request. It was an expectation, softened just enough to appear reasonable. I picked up the phone and typed a response, my fingers moving without hesitation, the words forming clearly because they had already settled in my mind long before this moment. "Not tonight." I read the message once before sending it, not to reconsider, but to ensure it said exactly what I intended. No explanation, no apology, no extension beyond what was necessary. I pressed send and placed the phone back on the table, watching as the screen dimmed and went dark. The silence that followed felt different again. Not just calm but defined. A boundary set without conflict, without escalation, but unmistakable in its presence. A few seconds later, the phone buzzed again, the immediate response arriving almost as expected. I did not pick it up right away. Instead, I walked into the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water, taking a slow sip before returning to the living room. When I finally looked at the screen, the message was longer this time. "I do not understand why. You are doing this. You are making things more difficult than they need to be." I read it carefully, noticing the shift. Confusion replacing certainty. Frustration replacing control. I set the phone down again without replying, not because I did not have an answer, but because I did not need to provide one. The explanation had already been given earlier that day, in a way that did not require repetition to remain valid. I sat down on the couch, the room quiet around me, the lamp casting a soft circle of light that felt contained, steady. For years, every conversation had been shaped by the need to reach resolution quickly, to restore balance as soon as possible, even if that balance was uneven. Now, I understood that not every moment required immediate resolution. Some things needed space, not to be avoided, but to be seen clearly without the pressure of immediate reaction. My phone remained on the table, silent again, the urgency of the earlier calls replaced by a pause that felt more telling than any words. I leaned back slightly, letting my head rest against the cushion, my eyes drifting toward the ceiling as I considered what had changed. Not them. Not their expectations. Those would likely remain the same for some time. What had changed was my response to those expectations. The automatic adjustment. The immediate compliance. The quiet acceptance of a role I had not chosen. All of that had shifted, not in a dramatic way, but in a steady, deliberate one that did not require reinforcement through conflict. And as I sat there, in the stillness of that evening, I realized something that felt both simple and significant. I was no longer waiting for permission to take my place in my own life. I had already stepped into it, and whatever came next would meet me there, not the other way around. The night grew deeper, the quiet outside settling into that still hour where even the occasional passing car became rare, and I found myself sitting in the same place, yet feeling entirely different from the person who had walked out of that dinner just a day before. The lamp beside me cast a steady glow, unchanged, but the way I experienced the room had shifted in a way that did not depend on anything outside of it. My phone remained on the table, silent. Now, the earlier messages and calls no longer pressing against me with the same urgency. Whatever needed to be said had already been said, not through long explanations or emotional exchanges, but through something far simpler. A refusal to step back into a role that had never truly belonged to me. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my knees, my hands loosely folded, and let my thoughts move without trying to direct them. For years I had measured my place in that family by how much I was willing to give without question, how quickly I could adjust, how smoothly I could absorb discomfort and turn it into something manageable. That had been my version of strength. Quiet, reliable, invisible in all the ways that made everything else easier for everyone else. But tonight, that definition no longer held the same weight. It was not that I had lost something. It was that I had finally stopped holding on to something that was never balanced to begin with. My phone lit up once more. A single message appearing on the screen. I did not reach for it immediately. I let it sit there for a few seconds, the soft glow fading in and out as the screen dimmed. When I finally picked it up, the message was shorter than the others, stripped of the tone that had carried through the day. Call me when you are ready. I read it once, then again, noticing the difference. No demand. No instruction. Just a statement, open-ended in a way that felt unfamiliar. I set the phone back down without replying, not because I was avoiding the conversation, but because I understood something clearly now. Readiness was not something that could be rushed or negotiated. It had to come from a place that was no longer shaped by pressure. I stood up slowly and walked toward the window, the glass reflecting a faint image of the room behind me, the outline of the lamp, the couch, the quiet space that had become something more than just a place to sit. It had become a place where I could finally hear my own thoughts without them being filtered through someone else's expectations. Outside, the street was nearly empty, the world moving at its own pace, unaffected by the small shift that had taken place inside this one apartment. And that realization brought with it a sense of calm that felt steady, not fleeting. I had spent so much time believing that change had to be loud to be real, that standing up for myself would require confrontation, explanation, or some kind of visible turning point that others could recognize. But what had happened over the past day had been none of those things. It had been quiet, measured, almost invisible from the outside. And yet, it had changed everything that mattered. I turned away from the window and looked around the room one more time, taking in the details that had once felt ordinary. The chair by the desk, the neatly stacked books, the closed drawer where the folder now rested, no longer something I avoided, but something I understood. It was not a weapon. It was not leverage. It was simply truth, documented and waiting, no longer ignored. I walked back to the table and picked up my phone again, holding it for a moment without unlocking it. The message remained on the screen, simple and still. Call me when you are ready. I let out a quiet breath, not heavy, not strained, just steady. For the first time, I did not feel the need to respond immediately, to explain my silence, or to soften what had already been made clear. Instead, I placed the phone back down exactly where it had been, turning it slightly so the screen faced away from me. Not out of avoidance, out of choice. I moved to the lamp and turned it off, the room dimming into a softer darkness that felt calm rather than empty. As I walked toward the bedroom, I paused briefly, my hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, grounding myself in the present moment. There was no final conversation, no dramatic resolution, just a quiet understanding that something fundamental had shifted, and that shift did not require validation from anyone else to be real. I continued into the bedroom, the door closing gently behind me, the rest of the apartment settling into stillness once more. And as I lay down, the events of the past day no longer replayed in sharp fragments or unanswered questions. They settled instead into something clear and complete. I had not been pushed aside. I had not been overlooked by accident. I had simply been placed in a position that I had continued to accept. And now I no longer did. There was no anger in that realization. No need to prove anything or reclaim anything in a way that required confrontation. There was only a quiet certainty, steady and unshaken. I did not need to move up in their ranking. I had stepped out of it entirely. And for the first time in a long time, that felt like exactly where I was supposed to be.